Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this episode of What Is On My Wrist, we are talking about the Rolex Oyster Quartz reference 17000. Really interesting reference. It's a quartz Rolex. I know that's kind of interesting, and we wanted to share this with you guys and talk a little bit about Rolex and their move into quartz watches at one period in time. And as a result, there's some really interesting watches, and I've got one on wrist, so let's get into the details. So this specific 17000, or what we could call maybe the 17,000 series, Rolex Oyster Quartz, commonly known as a Buckley dial. Hi, John Buckley. There's a guy, his name is John Buckley. He's a friend of ours, and basically the dial is named after John Buckley. But what a Buckley dial is, for those of you that don't know, is Rolex was actually printing Roman numerals on an opposing color dial from the text. So it was either white and black or black and white or blue and et cetera, et cetera. It's just a style variant named after Mr. Buckley. And the other thing that's really interesting is most Buckleys would have black enameled hands or white enameled hands that would match the outer printed Roman numerals. So this example is kind of cool and unique because it's not like your stereotypical like stick dial that you would see on a Datejust or something like that. It is actually a Buckley dial, which makes this specific 17,000, this reference 17,000, a little bit more kind of unique and interesting. But you can also get a Buckley dial in like a 1601 or a 1603 or an 1803 or whatever. So the Buckley dial came in both the Datejust and in the Day-Date reference range of watches in both Oyster Quartz and non-Oyster Quartz. So let's dive into the history a little bit of Oyster Quartz and talk about why these are cool and special and kind of unique as a whole. The Rolex Oyster Quartz basically started in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. And essentially, there was a period in time within like the watchmaking world, which is called the Quartz Crisis. So essentially what happened is the quartz circuit came into popularity and basically was more accurate, less expensive ultimately to produce, and a much better way ultimately of keeping time through the quartz circuit. So basically an electronic watch versus an automatic or manual version of keeping time through in a wristwatch. What's interesting is Rolex even today is a mechanical wristwatch company, but they did dip their toe into the quartz circuit. These quartz watches are pretty rare just because alongside of the mechanical watches that were being produced by Rolex, the quartz watches were also being produced. So I think it was kind of Rolex's way of like being a tech savvy company, leveraging horological technology at the time, but ultimately these didn't last for that long because Rolex Oyster Quartz production range really lasted less than 3 decades, making the entire range of Rolex Oyster Quartz watches pretty rare and also pretty sought after. We actually get a lot of people looking for Oyster Quartz watches specifically. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the Oyster Quartz watches, they use a totally different style of case. So we almost kind of have like, I don't want to really say it's like Royal Oak-like, but we have a case that is kind of different. It's not really an oyster style case. It's an Oyster Quartz style case. It's really different. But we've got an integrated bracelet into the case, and then we've kind of got this, more geometric style case versus, your stereotypical kind of like oyster style case, which you would see in the Datejust or the Day-Date range. Oyster Quartz references are highly sought after because it is estimated that there are less than 25,000 of them to have ever been produced by Rolex. And the other thing that is interesting is that Rolex, even though they were producing quartz watches, didn't stop production of their mechanical and or self-winding or automatic wristwatches of that era, which makes them kind of interesting and also highly collectible. The design, again, as we were talking about, is kind of, different than what we would have seen in a classic either Day-Date or Datejust in this case, as the angular case and the integrated bracelets are just very unique and almost kind of like architectural in their appearance, which is very much different from kind of your mainstream reference offerings from Rolex. The Rolex caliber 5035 movement is actually an 11 jewel quartz movement and is built and finished like one would expect from any high-end brand. So what's kind of cool about the finishing of Rolex's quartz movements versus maybe even like Patek Philippe is that Patek was leveraging a beta 21 circuit and there really wasn't a lot of beautification of those movements. Whereas if you really look at the 5035 quartz movement that is in the Oyster Quartz or the quartz movement that is in Date that was offered at the era, they're beautifully finished. There's perlage on the bridges and there's jewels and it's not like your stereotypical like tiny mini like quartz movement, if that makes sense. So the watch wears 36 millimeters, just like your standard Datejust. Really cool. This obviously being a Buckley dial, it's got a matte white dial with black Roman numerals and black hands, which provides a really high contrast and kind of striking look when it's being worn on the wrist. Obviously they made much more, there were other options. There were, kind of your stereotypical stick dial variants. There were versions that were made in two-tone, but this one is specifically in steel. Again, this angular integrated bracelet is actually quite comfortable on the wrist. It kind of reminds me almost of like a Audemars Piguet, Royal Oak or similar to maybe even like a Patek Nautilus in terms of its kind of like chunky like design. And then the other thing too is we do see advancements, being that this watch is from 1979. We do see the integration of a sapphire crystal as opposed to like a hesylite crystal. And this version specifically has a steel non-white gold fluted bezel. There's details here that are very much Rolex, but there are details that are kind of outside of what we would see in the norm. Setting the time is pretty easy. You basically have a couple of positions on the crown. You do have a quick set date function. So in the first position after you unscrew the crown, you can quickly advance the date. And then ultimately, the thing that is really cool, it is a hacking, quartz movement. So very precise in terms of its ability to accurately keep time. So in the setting position, the sweep seconds hand, in this case, the ticking seconds hand, actually does stop, allowing for a very precise setting of the time. And the other thing that's kind of interesting too is that this actually does tick. So this being a quartz movement, normally when you think of Rolex, you see, that nice gliding sweep seconds hand. This actually does have a ticking seconds hand, which again is very much quartz-like. The other thing that's I think kind of interesting and something that I would draw attention to is that in the same era and time, Rolex actually made what they called the 1530. Basically, it leverages this Oyster Quartz case, but it uses an automatic self-winding movement. So those are also very rare in the fact that they leverage this kind of geometric, almost architectural, geometric angular case, but they also use a normal automatic self-winding movement. So you kind of get that same style, but there are some details that make them quite unique. And the next time we have one, I'll be sure to do a review of one because I think that they're very interesting watches. So in any case, kind of a nice little piece of Rolex history, something that you don't see a lot of and something that is definitely becoming increasingly more collectible and something that is definitely worthy of some time on the wrist because it's Rolex, it's cool, but it's unique and kind of interesting. So I'll provide a link in the description below so that you can check out Oyster Quartz watches here at the Craft & Tailored online shop. As always, guys, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're not doing so already, follow us on Instagram at Craft & Tailored. And if you've got watch questions, we're here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailored.com. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you in the next one.